Lecture 2.1, Property Rights and the Rule of Law, the Basics. We've established that economic growth is the only way to effect sustained increases in standard of living. And, as the National Content Standards in Economics remind us, economic growth results from investments in human and physical capital, research and development, technological change, and improved institutional arrangements and incentives. Investment in capital is the key phrase here. Investment is the willingness to forego present consumption in anticipation of future benefit. And as we investigate the role of capitalist institutions, we find that property rights, secured by the rule of law, play a crucial role in shaping incentives for investment. So, we'll begin our investigation of capitalist institutions with these two, property rights and the rule of law that secures property rights. To briefly review, we've defined institutions. Remember, they are the accepted and expected patterns of human interaction, or as Doug North called them, the rules of the game. Institutions help to shape human behavior by establishing incentives, which we've defined as the rewards and punishments that influence people's choices. Charles Wheelen, author of the readable and highly popular book Naked Economics, explains the importance of incentives this way. Incentives matter. When we're paid on commission, we work harder. If the price of gasoline goes up, we drive less. If my 3-year-old daughter learns that she will get an Oreo if she cries while I'm talking on the phone, then she will cry while I'm talking on the phone. This was one of Adam Smith's insights in The Wealth of Nations. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Self-interest makes the world go around, a point that seems so obvious as to be silly. Human beings are complex creatures who are going to do whatever it takes to make themselves as well off as possible. Sometimes it's easy to predict how that will unfold. Sometimes it's enormously complex. In addressing social problems, Wheelen acknowledges that we don't have a proven formula, but he contends we do have a powerful tool. We know that people seek to make themselves better off, however they may define that. Our best hope for improving the human condition is to understand why we act the way we do, and then plan accordingly. Programs, organizations, and systems work better when they get the incentives right. It's like rowing downstream. To apply our understanding of incentives specifically to human choices about the use of productive resources, land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship, we focus on whether and how the institution of property rights and the rule of law can encourage the use of resources in ways that foster economic growth. Before we go on, let's take a minute to look at each of our two institutions separately. Property rights first. Property rights are the formal and informal arrangements that govern the ownership, use, and transfer of assets. First, note the formal or informal part of the definition. Formalization of property rights occurs in law and statute, and sometimes through bureaucratic regulation. For example, the student activity accompanying You're the Economist focuses on title as the formal legal evidence of the rights of possession and control over property. As we'll see, one of the big problems for people in the developing world is that landowners don't have title. Their property rights, if any, are largely informal, which makes the struggle to escape poverty even harder. While informal property rights may be clearly recognized in custom, tradition, and precedent, they've proven insufficient as a stepping stone out of poverty. They lack the power of secure title to foster capital growth. Full property rights are recognized to have 3 essential elements, which Rick Stroop of the Policy and Environment Research Center in Bozeman, Montana, calls the 3 Ds. Full property rights are defined, divestible, and defendable. When property rights are defined, the conditions of use are clearly specified. Restrictions are noted, including the conditions for earning income from the asset and the conditions for excluding other people from use of the asset. Divestibility refers to how property may be transferred from one person to another through sale, gift, inheritance, etc. There are usually both formal and informal restrictions on the transfer of property. Gun dealers have to be licensed, for example, clearly a formal requirement. Informally, we'd probably raise our eyebrows in surprise when parents don't leave their money to their children. Finally, and obviously, property rights are meaningless without enforcement. In economically developed countries, property rights are protected both formally through government institutions and informally through a heritage of expectation and acceptance. Some enforcement is done through the executive and judicial branches, but people also take part of the burden upon themselves by putting locks on their doors, hiring private security, living in gated communities, or putting clubs on the steering wheels of their cars. It's hard to overstate the importance of the informal dimension of property rights enforcement. The background outline for Lesson 2 of the CAP unit includes a case study of the Dalits, or who used to be known as the Untouchables in India. Formally, the 160 million Dalits have the same property rights as all other Indian citizens. Informally, however, the persistence of a 15-year-old cultural tradition renders those rights virtually meaningless because they're not enforced. The disparity between property rights in the developed and developing worlds is stark, but it's having property rights that is relatively new, not the absence of those rights. Just as widespread material comfort is relatively new in human history, so is the right to property. Until the mid-18th century, ownership of property, even something so fundamental as a person's own labor, was the exception rather than the rule. The only people who owned property, even their own labor, were those with enough strength to assert and enforce that ownership. It's for this reason that the strident slogan, "People, not property," is so misguided. Property rights are human rights. In fact, they are arguably the most fundamental of all human rights. If we think about it, the slogan seems to suggest that property has rights, which is nonsense. Property rights are more properly conceived of as the rights of humans to freely use and transfer their possessions, including themselves. To suggest that property rights and human rights are separable is to deny the fundamental importance of a person's ownership of himself, his talents, and his labor. Sadly, this right wasn't routinely recognized until the Enlightenment, and even today, millions in developing countries are still denied the full benefits that self-ownership entails. Importance of securing property rights through effective enforcement brings us directly to the second institution we want to consider in this lesson, the rule of law. It was the institutionalization of the rule of law in Europe in the 18th century that made individual property rights viable. When governments gained a monopoly on coercion, competitive violence in society was greatly reduced, making it possible to secure citizens' ownership of assets. Because the cost to individual people of securing their own property rights is usually prohibitively high, the poor benefited most from this development. Think about how expensive it is to secure property rights on your own. It took a lot of knights and a lot of wealth to secure a medieval castle. Property rights enforcement is characterized by huge economies of scale, something the rich can afford by living in castles or gated communities with private security, for example, and the poor cannot. By and large, poor people depend on public enforcement of their property rights, and the increasing ability of government to provide that protection after the mid-1700s was a huge boon to the lower classes. Even today, we can see examples like the illegal drug trade, where the inability of the government to monopolize coercion imposes the greatest burden of murder and violence not on the rich, but on the urban poor. If property ownership is to provide incentives for investment, the necessary precursor to the creation of the capital for economic growth, owners must be secure in the expectation that their rights will be enforced. So it makes little sense to examine the institution of property rights without also looking more closely at the many ways property rights can be secured. In a nice connection to students' civic education, we find that property rights can be secured in one of three ways. through the rule of physical force or anarchy, through the rule of man, or through the rule of law. Anarchy is that state of competitive violence that preceded the establishment of the nation-state. Under conditions of anarchy, physical force carries the day. Property rights exist only for those with the ability to take and defend them, or the wealth to pay others to do so. Peaceful transfer of property rights, even through inheritance, is uncommon. Picture in your mind the violence that so often accompanied the death of European monarchs. The second way in which property rights can be secured is through the rule of man. An improvement on anarchy, but as the chaotic poverty of much of Africa attests, a very small step given the scope of what's needed. Under the rule of man, formal law may exist, but enforcement is capricious, and rulers routinely exempt themselves and their friends from its constraints. Property rights under these circumstances are secure only for those who bask in the goodwill of the rulers. Enforcement of such property rights as are recognized is inconsistent and arbitrary, and the transfer of rights is subject to the whim of those in power. Effectively, this means that the wealthy, who are in a position to influence the power structure, have property rights, however tenuous, and the poor have none. Which brings us to the third and the most desirable option for our goal of economic growth and improved living conditions. The rule of law is defined by the National Content Standards for Civics and Government as an essential component of limited government, in which a society is governed according to widely known and accepted rules, followed not only by the citizens, but also by those in authority. The bottom line is that under the rule of law, even the poor can be secure in their property rights, which gives them the opportunity to use their assets to improve their well-being. Economic growth, investment, incentives, property rights, the rule of law. We've got all the vocabulary in place. In the next lecture, we'll look at the dynamics of how property rights secured by the rule of law encourage economic growth by creating investments for the creation of wealth-producing capital.